Good afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Tao Li for today's Grand Rounds. I've known Dr. Li for a number of years, and we have collaborated on many projects together. Dr. Li is an internationally recognized expert in digital learning, medical licensing exam preparation, and student engagement in medical education. He earned his medical degree at the University of California, San Francisco, trained in internal medicine at Yale New Haven Hospital, and completed an allergy and immunology fellowship and a master's in health sciences at Johns Hopkins University. He has authored over 40 textbooks, including the First Aid for Board series. He's currently the chief of adult allergy and immunology at the University of Louisville and chief education officer of Scholar RX, a global platform for shared medical curriculum. Tao and I co-chaired the Health Professions Education Curriculum Exchange Working Group for Mebiquitous, the standard-setting organization of the AAMC. Tao recruited and brought to this discussion 28 members from diverse national and international allopathic and osteopathic organizations within undergraduate medical education, including student organizations, graduate medical education, and continuing medical education, nursing education, and vendors. The breadth of people he knows and is able to bring help to collaborate on projects is simply amazing. For anyone who wants to look for Tao at a medical education conference, simply look for a crowd of medical students surrounding an Asian male taking selfies. That's all you have to do. We're fortunate that Tao is able to join us today because he's a very busy man. And I often joke that he seems to be spending less time at home than in hotel rooms. So Tao, are you in a hotel room today?
Fortunately, I'm in my own home for the next day or two, but then I'll be on the road for about 3 weeks. All right. Well, I think that is my cue. Well, again, it's a delight to be here. Thank you, Terry Ma, and to Steve Scott for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be, speaking to you virtually on what I think is a very important subject about engaging students where they are and where they want and where they feel like they need to be. So, so first order of business, as per Wendy Fitzgerald's request, is to show you the disclosure slide, which you see here, and it has all the disclosure and mitigation actions per the CME office.
Excuse me, Dr. Lee, you need to share your screen. We can't see your slides.
That would really help. Sorry, for what reason I already thought I had done that, but I had not. So Wendy, can everybody see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's restart. My apologies. And let me resize my screen a little bit so it's I can see everything. All right. Okay, so again, title of my talk is Engaging Medical Students in the Parallel Curriculum. And here is the disclosure slide from the medical school. And then these are my disclosures: CEO and founder of Scholar X and USLRX, author of First Aid for the US20 series, a publication McGraw-Hill. And there will be multiple commercial product mentions, which is inevitable when you talk about the parallel curriculum. All right. So, but that being said, I think these disclosures are important because I think it provides a unique perspective in terms of what the parallel curriculum is and what are the experiences there and why do people find it important. I also want to acknowledge input from my colleagues, at ScholarX. These are educators at other institutions: Tyson Piddle at Baylor College of Medicine, Jeremy Richards at Western Atlantic University and also at Harvard, and Carlos Rodriguez at University of Porto in Portugal. All right. The learning objectives are the following. After completing this session, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to discuss the rise and impact of the parallel curriculum. Then we'll be able to describe outcomes related to the parallel curriculum, and then we'll explore strategies for engaging students in the parallel curriculum. So what is this parallel curriculum? So, you've often heard of it potentially used with other related terms, such as the formal curriculum or the declared curriculum or the explicit curriculum, right? So this is the curriculum that's formally offered, at your institution. It often shows up as course syllabi, learning objectives, documents from your curriculum committee, and so forth. There is the informal curriculum, which sometimes is documented in the formal curriculum itself, but it often is all the casual and interpersonal, interactions with the educators and between the educators and the students, that happens typically outside of formal learning environments. Then there is the hidden curriculum, which is not as much as what you say, but more about what you do and the students observing you, in terms of, what do we actually do? So we may say one thing, but we may do something different. And the students are taking their cues from that. So it's more subtle, it's more subliminal, perhaps even unconscious, but it can implicitly, express values and what's truly important at an organization or an institution, regardless of what they explicitly say. And then finally, the parallel curriculum, which is something that is external to the formal curriculum, typically does not involve the formal educators or professional educators of that institution, typically driven by the students themselves, where they have a somewhat different goal, typically in this case, USMLE or COMLEX preparation, and they are using resources typically found outside of your institution, like first aid or questions banks like UWorld and other resources to prepare for these exams. And I think the question becomes, when you look at this curricular multiverse, how do these various curricula interact with each other? How do they perhaps get each other's way? And is there a way to align them or benefit from each other? And I think that'll be kind of the thesis that I'll drive in this presentation for the next 40 minutes or so. So, so a little bit about, one of the major resources that's used in the paracurriculum, my text, First Aid for the USMLE Step 1. This itself was started by UCSF students in 1989. At the time, the NBME, the certifying exam at the time for second-year medical students was the NBME Part 1. Some of you might recall that. There was also, I think, a different set of exams for international medical graduates. I think it was the FLEX or the SPECS. And the USMLE Step 1, which essentially unified all this, wasn't really introduced until roughly 1990. And the students there, recognized this new entity coming and felt that, they had to do something. And so therefore, First Aid came into being. It was initially written as a bit of a crowdsourced relational database. I think we used at the time Paradox 3 for any of you folks who remember back of those programs back in the day. So the interesting thing about this relational database is that each entry was limited to 256 characters. So it wasn't something that we purposely chose. It was just a limitation of the computer application we used to develop this database of high yield facts, for self-assessment. In a way, this was Twitter before Twitter existed, right, with its 140 characters. We developed a 3-column structure, to help organize the information. The first column, focuses on the topic, identifies the topic. The second column is the high yield fact to be recalled and applied. And the third column typically is tied to a mnemonic or to, some application or or correlation, clinical correlation, pathophysiology correlation that brings home the value of that high yield fact. I joined on the fourth edition when I was the editor-in-chief of the university newspaper at UCSF. And as they say, the rest is history. We helped expand the book, flesh it out. It was a tiny little publication at the time. It had become nationally published through a small publisher called Appleton Lang. You might still know about the Lang series, and it's now before it got acquired by McGraw-Hill, and now we're in our 34th edition. This book has spawned numerous other first aid books, and there's over 1 million copies of this in print. And not only did it spawn other first aid books, but it spawned many other resources, many that were also student driven at the time, but then many for other reasons, many provided by other educators, and also just other platforms and organizations. So that includes ScholarX, Kaplan, we all know, UWorld, and so forth. So there are many of these resources out here, and you probably see your students talking about many of these resources, every day. So, so there have been a number of studies asking about what the students are using. This was a best evidence medical education guide published in Medical Teacher by Tutsi Harumi from University of Central Florida that looked at this. He looked at close to 20 studies, and if you're having to squint, that's on purpose because there's a lot here. So if you go down the third column, you'll see all the resources that these various institutions and authors have studied, and you can see many of the same things, like a first aid, Kaplan, UWorld, Sketchy, et cetera, et cetera. You'll also, if you have an opportunity to take a closer look, you'll notice that most of these are small studies, single center studies. Most of these were essentially cohort or observational studies, so non-prospective, not truly experimental, not typically a prospective. So I think there were a couple of prospective cohort studies there, and they typically had use-only outcomes or complex outcomes, as a dependent, a variable of interest, as an outcome. And so, and you can see that most of these studies were prior to pandemic. So from 2013 to 2022, when this survey of the literature was done. So that's just to give you a sense of what's out there. And you can see there are many things, and they evolve, every year. But when they thematically, looked at these studies and tried to extract, certain themes, they did ask certain questions, such as, what's driving students to use the external resources, and not a surprise to anyone at all. Students are using this to prepare for high stakes exams, including the USLA, primarily because they want to ensure a competitive residency match, the next stage of their career. And for the students here, your career, right? So not a shocker. And as a corollary, and again, not a surprise, most students do not find adequate resources or experience that are provided directly by their schools to prepare for the USMLA. Fortunately, students are using this to improve general knowledge retention. That is something that came out of these observational studies, surveys, and so forth, which does tie into general curricular goals at most medical schools. When students select resources, what are they typically looking for? Far and away, the most important thing for students is that these resources include high quality US-only style questions in general. Now, there are exceptions, but that's typically what you see, whether it's things like RX or UWorld or ComBank, things like that. Tied to that is perceived effectiveness for exam preparation. So what are the upperclassmen telling them? What do they see on Reddit? What do they Google? What do they see in the back in the surveys and resource recommendations in first aid? They do also look for perceived effectiveness relative to the formal curriculum as well too. And then lastly, ease of use or accessibility relative to the formal curriculum. So there is more than one goal that they are aiming for. They are often aiming to achieve that two birds with one stone effect, preparing both for their high stakes exams, including the USMLE, and performing well in the curriculum that you've developed for them at the University of Houston. That being said, there's been a question about, well, if the students are really engaging in all these curricular resources, what does that mean in terms of their behavior at the medical school, particularly inside the classroom? So you've seen a lot of discussion and perhaps hand-wringing about students not going to class, students not showing up in the lecture hall, right? So here's this article from Stat Media several years ago about students skipping classes in droves. Has this really cute little tumbleweed rolling through the front here. If you go to the website, more recently, there was this article in NPR just last year about students not showing in class and what does that mean for the future of medicine. This involved essentially an op-ed with a professor at Brown University, and it was a faculty student op-ed perspective piece, in NPR. And when I did a version of this talk several years ago, it was back actually in 2018. You could argue that there was this potential checking out, perhaps tuning in effect. So what I mean by that, so in the WMC Medical School Y2Q Year 2 questionnaire, Y2Q survey, which actually started in 2014, they had a question about whether students hardly ever went to class, sometimes went to class, often went to class, or always went to class. So in the almost never attended category, when they first started collecting this data, it was around about 16-17%. And then what you see over the years is a trend up. And again, I gave this talk in 18. You see missing data from 18, because I went back to the site to try to pull the data, but it only went back to 2019. They've been expending data. And so you'll notice that's what had been happening, at least up to the pandemic. And as you can expect in the pandemic, we all got kicked out of the classroom, right? But an interesting thing happened later on. It went the other way. Now we can debate what that is and so forth. I would argue that at some point educators finally figured out that lectures for a whole variety of reasons aren't really where it's at anymore. And as other types of activities like, CBL or modified PBL or TBL became more prevalent, that were more interactive and focused more on active learning, that brought students back in the classroom. There may be also things around mandatory attendance and whatnot. But I think largely many schools have been moving away from lectures because they can already do it in their PJs, right? We all record these lectures and we put it on Panopto, MediaSite, 360, whatnot, and the students at a click of a button can watch it at home. They don't have to be here. I don't have to be here. We can just be, outside the classroom per se, but still tuning in. So when I did this talk, you could see there was a trend and rising trend towards students watching lectures and podcasts daily. Again, this was documented in the Y2 questionnaire. And since then, this has kind of been bouncing back and forth. You can see a bit of a spike, of course, during the first year of the pandemic. But where there was a real change was the spike in external videos. So on watching videos on YouTube or Vimeo or online other commercial resources, right? So you see actually a spike there. And interestingly, it spiked and peaked before the pandemic. And interestingly, the pandemic didn't drive it up any higher. That was something that was a bit of a surprise to me. But the key thing is that the engagement with external videos or external multimedia has remained high. ever since the 2019, regardless of the pandemic and the post-pandemic situation, as far as we can tell. So, I think the bottom line is that the students remain engaged, but they're shifting their attentions, they're shifting their presence elsewhere, depending on what makes sense, what's the most effective use of their time, and we'll talk about how we can engage with that later on. So now let's talk about the parallel curriculum itself. So there are many things out there, but perhaps one of the more popular self-directed teaching tools are visual mnemonics, memory palaces, based on memory palace models. Picmonic is one. Sketchy is arguably more prevalent, but there was this study done at Midwestern University, Arizona College of Medicine. Mark Spiker, who's now at ACOM, was the senior author, but working with Deal Yang, who was a student and the co-founder of Picmonic at the time. They did do an RCT, which is rare, actually, if you think about it, in medical education. They randomized students to the Picmonic visual tool with text-based learning materials or just text-based learning materials alone. And they were given equal time, in both the control and the intervention group. And then there were assessments immediate, 1 week and 1 month. This is a bit of a busy slide, so I put red boxes around the key outcomes to pay attention to. So session 1 was immediate recall, session 2 was 1 week, session 3 was 1 month. And in all 3 of these sessions, they did free recall. So they simply said, okay, you learned about the criteria for Sjogren's syndrome using Picmonic or just text. Now just give us those attributes again, right? And you could see that there, both in the immediate and then in the 1 week and 1 month recall, there appears to be significant differences in those scores. And then when you look at the mean percentage differences, there were these large differences that actually grew over time, because while both had decay, right, scores of 19 to 8 and then 7, the decay was arguably less on the visual mnemonic side. So 32 to 21 to 22. And so therefore, increases in the mean score percentage differences, particularly when compared to the traditional text-based method. So another study was from that's often is cited is by Francis Deng, who did the study also when he was a senior medical student at WashU St. Louis. It was a retrospective cohort study. So they surveyed medical students, got a reasonable response rate, and found out what type of resources they were using, and broke it down into resources that were centered around spaced repetition flashcards and question banks. These were the resources that they looked at, and you could see that there was quite a bit of spaced repetition going on with the flashcards, either when they were using Anki and Firecracker, which is not really used that much anymore, with a mean of anywhere between 5,100 to 4,600, depending on the product they were using, with wide standard deviations, and using it for quite a period of time. In a multivariate linear regression model, they saw that the variables that predicted performance on step 1 score when it was reported later, it was the use of MCQs and some flashcards, but not all flashcards. So the Anki flashcards, did have a statistically significant p-value, but the Firecracker did not. So so this was some of the earlier evidence with regards to the use of spaced repetition, but with questions and flashcards. Another study that's often quoted is Jesse Burke-Raffel, who's now at NYU. He did a retrospective cohort study at University of Michigan with Sally Satin and Joe Perkis, who I think is now at University of California, Riverside. And so they were looking to document student step 1 preparation behaviors at the University of Michigan, and then study the association with step 1 outcomes. They surveyed students over 2 classes, got a very high response rate, and found it and was able to document that these were the resources that they use. Again, a lot of the usual suspects that you recognize here, and then in a again a multivariate linear regression model in their master model, they identified that having having a higher score goal, starting your studying earlier, multiple review book passes. This was basically code word for first aid. And then the number of unique MCQ questions from commercial banks were all significant predictors of USMLE Step 1 outcomes. Interestingly, not repeating the questions, repeating questions was not significant. So doing a question bank for, let's say, 2 or 3 times did not appear to have an impact in the model with in the fully adjusted model. And so this is a slide that Jesse has shared with us. So he basically found that after controlling for a student's MCAT score, preclinical performance, and self-identified score goal, again, studying earlier, passes through first aid, and doing unique QBank questions, had these respective effect sizes, 4.2, 2.3, 7.0, assuming the question bank was roughly 2,000 questions with these confidence intervals. And as I mentioned, gender, minority status, day studies, and repeated studies, and we'll get to this day study, repeated questions did not seem to impact USMLE Step 1 outcomes. Okay, Banos at University of Alabama School of Medicine studied students that were given a question bank. So this is the Kaplan Step 1 question bank during their organ system curriculum. So this is different from the previous 2 studies. In the previous 2 studies, the students essentially did this on their own, bought with their own dime. Here, this resources was given to the students. However, the school did not prescribe it. The school did not directly integrate into the curriculum. All use was voluntary. That being said, the resource was used significantly. Average number of questions attempted was around 660. And what they found was that adjusting for MCAT and for interaction effects, the number of item bank, the number of Kaplan item bank questions attempted, did predict outcomes on exams, class exams, NBME customized assessment, module final grade, and the USMLE Step 1. But interestingly, and why I think this got a little bit more attention was it when they did subgroup analyses and stratified students by their MCAT scores, low to high, they saw stronger beta coefficients, essentially. So these would be the little dotted lines, in those cohorts of students that had, a lower MCAT score. So perhaps a greater benefit, after adjusting for other confounders, on these exams. So in general, do external resources improve USMLE performance? So in Harumi's paper, just keep in mind this was a non-pooled qualitative analysis. So this was not a meta-analysis. There was too much variance and too much difference in how the variables were defined and collected and so forth to actually do a meta-analysis. So when they did more of a qualitative analysis, thematically, they did find strong correlations between the use of QBanks and spaced repetition products like flashcards for Step 1 performance. And they saw correlations with the number of items and with early preparation. So that echoes some of the findings from both Jesse Burke-Raffel's study and Francis Deng's study from WashU, St. Louis, and from University of Michigan, respectively. Sean Tackett's group from Hopkins looked, and from other institutions, also looked at factors as well too, and did also essentially a qualitative study. It was not a true meta-analysis, but they pulled a lot of the same literature, and what they did was they looked at but what they did here, which was a little different, was they looked at all the studies, and then they looked at all the factors that were studied. So whether it's gray or dark gray, this was a factor that was studied, such as the number of USLink Step 1 questions that a student did prior to sitting for the exam. And the dark bars is the dark segment signifies where they found a positive association, and the light bar is no positive association. And so what you see here is that in the preponderance of story studies, USLink Step, the number of items, seem to, be in the majority of studies. The performance, while there were fewer studies doing it, virtually all of them showed a strong correlation between performance on a self-assessment or what they were doing in their daily scores and the USLink outcomes. Where they saw weaker correlations or no or lack of correlation is the number of practice tests, the commercial review book, which includes first aid. So this one segment is probably first aid, and then the commercial courses. They did see that earlier start time for exam studying seemed to have a strong signal. The amount of time that was dedicated for preparation time did not seem to be a positive predictive value, a positive predictor for US. In fact, in some studies they saw a reverse correlation, which is the longer a student was given in dedicated period, the less likely the less likely they were to perform as well. They didn't see any evidence for study groups, and school-based programs was a mixed bag. All right, so let's talk about engaging students in the parallel curriculum. All right, so one of the things that we often talk about in education is fostering a state of self-directed learning with in partnership with our students. So what does that mean? So self-directed learning refers to learners taking initiative for their own learning. Because you think about it, right? When and I think students, for the students in the room, you've already probably been told this. At some point, when you are in independent practice, unsupervised practice, after you have graduated medical school, after you have finished residency, after you've gone through board certification, at that point, you're essentially, in independent practice and also, essentially supervising yourself. Yes, there is CME. Yes, you may have maintenance. Yes, you will have maintenance of certification and so forth. But by and large, on a day-to-day basis, you are the captain of your own ship. And so in order to do that, you have to build the skills and habits for lifelong learning, right? Which is very closely related, to the idea of self-directed learning. So you have to be able to identify learning needs, seek it. It involves a process called self-regulated learning, which kind of falls under the broader umbrella of self-directed learning. So again, there's kind of a cycle to this. You identify the learning gap, you identify the need, then you identify and acquire resources to use to close the gap. You reflect on those learning outcomes, you apply those new knowledge and skills, and then you study the results, and then you reassess your gap. If your gap is closing, you're moving in the right direction. If your gap is not closing or expanding, then you need to look for a different strategy. All right. So that's a little bit about self-directed learning. And this paper, which is well worth looking at, was a joint effort between AAMC and the Shapiro Institute at Beth Israel Deaconess. It's called the Millennial Conference. AAMC sponsored it. The Shapiro Institute puts it on. They bring together these thought leaders. So when we think about self-directed learning, what the students are doing, this is exactly what they're doing in the parallel curriculum, right? The students have identified a need. Hey, there's this thing called the step 1. If I don't pass this thing, I'm not going to be on the clerkships, or I am not going to get into the residency in my dreams. And so they go out, they identify the resources. If you can provide them with great advice through student success, fantastic. And if there's corroborating data that's been helpful, of course they'll use it. But they're going out, they're identifying external resources, whether it be first aid or UWorld or Sketchy or whatnot, or Pathoma. They're using it, they're sharing notes, they're reflecting on their outcomes. So they're actually doing self-directed learning right now. It's just not documented, right? They're just doing this on their own. And again, somebody made this comment at a recent conference when faculty express frustration at why students aren't doing what we think they're supposed to do, right? But the reality is they're just playing the game that we've set the rules for. Now, when we say we, it's not just you, it's the NBME, it's LCME, it's AAMC, it's all of us, it's the entire ecosystem, the regulatory, academic, even industrial, the students are smart, they're figuring out the game, and you can't fault them if they're not playing the game the way you want them to, right? So that's just my editorial comment. We can talk a little bit more about that and hopefully in the Q&A in just a little bit. But to me, this is a form of SDL. Now, how can you establish a healthy self-directed learning culture? So again, I think this paper is worth going to. They break it into 4 groups of elements: the institutional environment, the learning environment that really drives curiosity-based learning, recognizing the attributes in the learners themselves that we want to cultivate that will help drive motivation, both internal and external. The pedagogy and the faculty development. So all of us as educators, who are working in partnership with the students in terms of, our own competency and skills in terms of coaching, in terms of really pushing the students, surface versus deep questioning, and then the right assessment strategy that promotes this. I mean, we all know that classic aphorism, right? Assessment drives learning, right? So to what extent do we assess self-directed learning at our institutions? How do we do that explicitly? How aware are the students of the explicit need to develop these levels of these types of competencies around self-directed learning, and how they are actually assessed in both a qualitative and a quantitative way? So, the paper has a number of recommendations, which I will let you go through, but a couple of things that stand out a little bit tied to those groups of elements include developing an inquiry-based learning environment, again, that promotes curiosity, asking questions, acknowledging certainty, and also setting up opportunities for what are called productive failure. So that's a term coined by Miriam Malopoulos, Nikki Woods from University of Toronto about, failure as a way of learning and identifying gaps and so forth, but you just want the failure to be in a safer environment and done in a productive way that, a student and their teacher, educator, coach can learn from. Providing feedback on the process of learning, right? So how are they going through this SDL process? Providing them with, data, artifacts that will help with their reflection, and then developing, instruments, standards, and measures that, can help, document and demonstrate competence in self-directed learning. There are other models. The Master Adaptive Learning model is essentially self-directed learning, self-regulating. This is from Bill Coutre at Vanderbilt with support from the AMA. There's now, I think they published a book a couple of years ago about it. And when you look at these gears here, very similar to the concepts in self-regulated learning. And then, they have a concept of a battery, which is what keeps students going, what gets student going and what keeps students going. And they also call on similar traits such as curiosity, motivation, mindset, growth mindset in particular, and resilience in what students, want to cultivate, and what we as educators and coaches and mentors, want to develop, in these future independent practitioners. Another concept that's tied to self-directed learning is the idea of student involvement in their own education process, right? Education is not something that should be done to students. Education is something that should be done in partnership with students, right? So this is the Adam Fletcher ladder of student involvement. It's based on work by Roger Hart, done with UNESCO back in 1993. This was done originally in the K through 12 space, but it's been adapted in a number of other spaces, including higher education, medical education. It describes 8 levels of student involvement. Now, the first 3, according to Roger Hart, doesn't actually involve true student involvement. They're there, but they're not there. They're either been manipulated. They're there as decoration and their tokenism. But where they start to get involved is whether they're informed, whether they're consulted, and then also where they eventually have any accountability and responsibility for their own outcomes, as part of the education process, right? And the highest level is where the student and the teacher and administration have an equitable relation, not an equal, but an equitable relationship, where students are involved in decision making and driving their own destiny. Okay, and that is something that's been increasingly recognized as important. AMI, which is an international association for health professionals in education, it's started off in Europe, but it's truly a global organization, launched an award program called the Aspire Award, and a number of U.S. schools apply for this and do get this. One of our partners, University of Miami, actually just won the Aspire Award about a year or two ago for student engagement. In their criteria for the Aspire Student Engagement Award, they say that there should be just demonstrated evidence that students are involved in the management of the school, including matters of policy and vision. So not just education, but the overall school. Provision of the school's education program, so teaching and assessment. So that's what we've been talking about. The academic community. So that includes research and health services, and then the local community. So where that school is, engaged and integrated, as part of the community practice and so forth. And and you've seen it. If there are numerous examples of students being involved at multiple levels, in the school, and hopefully they are in yours, and hopefully we can share examples of what you're doing. But here's an example. Again, Jesse Burke-Raffel and other students at University of Michigan used a curriculum template by Thomas Kern from Hopkins to develop a U.S. only exam advising program that was student-led, student-initiated, faculty-guided, administration-guided, and evidence-based. So there was a coalition of student, staff, and faculty that incorporated institutional values, did a really initial needs assessment, lit review, worked with the students to develop survey instruments, gather the survey instruments, figure out their behaviors, correlated to the literature, correlated to outcomes, and then provided just in time, advice to the students so they could adjust their strategies for approaching the USMLE, and then changing the data and actually making a cycle out of that. So that's one example, but there may be numerous other examples, many I'm sure, maybe even at your institution. Then, going beyond just as part of student involvement, there's also the idea of co-creation, and so this is where there's an equitable partnership with close collaboration between learners and teachers to improve the learning process. So they're either part of the design, or they're also part of developing, the curriculum materials, or designing the assessments and so forth. And so, so this is also related to the idea of participatory design. So co-creation, co-design, participatory design, those are relative synonyms. And here is an implementation framework for that, where we can think about developing initiatives that motivate the learners to engage in co-creation, and you can go through stuff. But basically, there are essentially aspects and outcomes that you want to drive for the learners, the educators, the organization, and then the interaction between the learners and the teacher together. What can they do synergistically together that they couldn't do apart, right? So this paper in Medical Teachers worth a look. And then finally, this is something that's close and dear to our hearts. So, this goes back to my roots in first aid. If you recall, first aid is a student-to-student book. So something that's used virtually everywhere, and including, in a lot of medical school, was student initiated and now is student maintained, every year. And we believe that there's an opportunity to actually scale this up organizationally. So we have partnered with essentially all of the medical student organizations in the world, including the big US ones like AMSA, SOMA, SNMA, along with the big international groups, to develop a student-driven curricular alliance called the Medical Student Alliance for Global Education that capacitates them to do their own needs assessments and design and build their own education resources. They build it on our platform. We have again a shared learning platform called Bricks. It's used by a lot of different medical schools, but it has an authoring component that allow educators and student as educators to build their own modules. And as you can see here, they've done their own global needs assessment and have developed a whole number of collections in many areas. And you can see that most of them does not explicitly have anything to do with the USMLE. Digital health, planetary health, global health, which is just launched a couple of months ago, health systems, which is basically health system science, which launched last week, social accountability, diversity, equity, inclusion, students, educators, sexual and reproductive health. These are weighty issues that are transforming the practice of medicine, and the students are out in front identifying that, obviously with other organizations, and going after that with expert partners to develop open access education modules that could be used, and they are being used actually by a number of schools, as part of their curriculum. Particularly if you don't have a climatologist on staff, or maybe you don't have, a global health faculty on staff. This is where things like this makes sense in terms of sharing the wealth and the experience and having students actually help drive some of this process. So to wrap up, this is a 12, Medical Teachers has a series called 12 Tips. This is 12 tips for enhancing student engagement. And you can see there's a number of, of points that they like to drive, tips. And we just summarize it here, but it echoes a number of things that you saw earlier, such as creating a culture that empowers students to be engaged, creating frameworks for formal student engagement, including assessment, maximizing feedback, formally including student representatives in governance, involving students in curriculum design and development to the highest levels, making peer teaching part of the curriculum, and involving students in peer support programs. And there are obviously many others, tactics and strategies that that are included and go beyond Harms Peter's paper. So at the end of the day, this idea of a formal curriculum and a parallel curriculum don't actually have to exist as two separate multi-universes or multiverses. They could actually, get closer together and perhaps even overlap and merge with time, as we find a way to end students, to successfully engage with students, in the formal curriculum. So with that, I thank you for your time and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Are there any questions? I'm monitoring online as well. I do have a quick question that someone posed to us. How can we get your slides?
Absolutely. I will PDF this right after this talk.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Timothy Bowen. The early part of this talk, which I really enjoyed, about students in the basic sciences often not going to lectures. How does that fit with having feedback into what is taught? And the second is, if those that don't go to lectures are competent, measured by step one, what does this say about the need for an extensive basic science faculty on a medical school?
Yeah, so to get to the great question. To go to the first question, which is class attendance, and if I recall, class attendance and the value of the lecture. To me, the lecture is still a valid way of engaging with students as long as it's active and as long as it demonstrates relevance. So as an allergies immunologist, if I were to go in and just give a talk on, hey kids, let's talk about IL-4, IL-15, IL-5, and IL-13, and let's go through these cytokines. Oh yeah, this mediates eosinophilic migration. This does, smooth muscle, blah blah blah. You know, at some point the students are going to ask, well, what's the relevance? So it's up to us as educators to help to define that relevance to them. And as basic science educators, we need to partner with our clinical science colleagues to to tie that relevance, because there's actually strong evidence, and particularly from Nikki Wood's group, that strong basic science strong mastery of basic science competency in the clinical years improves adaptive expertise, which ties into successful self-directed learning, self-regulated learning, and the master adaptive learning model. Let's see, and can you just repeat that second question again? I apologize.
Well, how extensive do you need a basic science faculty if you could have lectures done like these online learning courses that you see advertised in the New York Times Review of Books, to learn Socrates or calculus or something?
So to me, the faculty, whether you're a basic science or a clinical scientist, is still quite important. But the role of that educator is shifting. There was a recent study that talked about there was a survey a couple of years ago about what is the role of medical educators in 2025. This was done, I think, in 2020. And one of the major roles is to be, and Ron Harden in his book about the 8 roles of a teacher talks about this as well too, is that all of these resources, whether they're active or whether they're not passive or interactive. So a book, I think, is more passive because versus something that's interactive, like interactive multimedia or so forth, still requires a human, at least until we get to that day of AGI, and I don't think we're quite ready for that discussion yet, to help through a Socratic method, through inquiry-based learning, to really challenge the student and really the novice clinician, who will be hopefully one day an expert clinician, about how you integrate these concepts together, what it applies, how do you use this in critical thinking, diagnostic clinical reasoning, and clinical management, and then how do you weigh this when you engage with the student's story, with the patient's story through narrative medicine and so forth. So there's a lot going on beyond just the facts on the page or within that module or even within that video. And we as educators, whether we're basic or clinical, we got to collaborate with each other to help, design those inquiry-based pathways that again drives curiosity, drives the students to hunger for even more. Kind of like the more they learn, the more they want to know, and the more they want to be able to do. So hope that helps. I know I'm at time, but I see Terry, but I see another question from Dr. Wing. Should I answer that?
Yes, please.
So the question is, are there studies on the student behavior absences use of third-party resources with student populations similar to ours? We admit predominate from economic disadvantaged populations. I believe there is, and I think I'm vaguely aware, but I don't know as much of that comes out. I'd have to take a look. I do know that that often in student success circles, again, because of the lived experiences of these particular populations, that perhaps conventional strategies that might work with say higher scoring, higher MCAT, doesn't necessarily work as well. Often you're dealing with, particularly in populations that have gone through have had a more challenging life experience, they often have they still, they have these things that we often don't think about. Like, in fact, at AAMC, there's going to be a session, I think, next week about, dealing with medical students that are homeless, medical students that are dealing with hunger, that don't, that have to, hold down one or two jobs while they're going through medical school just to make ends meet, because they're not getting enough financial aid and whatnot. So there are things that are often outside of what we think of the formal academic environment that can have a profound effect, particularly on this vulnerable group of students. So I recognize, Dr. Green, that's not a complete answer, but I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your joining us for today's talk. We really appreciate it. And have a great have a great 3 weeks of traveling. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.